G'day and welcome to the Campfire project. Today I'm here with Roberto Mayer. Roberto's path started early, mentoring peers in maths and science at just 12 years old, from programming in the early days of microcomputers to publishing IT books, teaching at Sao Paulo University, and leading international trade associations. His career has spanned technology, academia, and social impact. He has spoken in 40 countries, authored books in both IT and personal growth, and co-founded a global support network. Today, he shares his Sino life methodology to guide others towards purpose and meaning. Welcome to the Campfire Project, Roberto.
Thanks, Alan. A pleasure to be here with you. I hope I can share something useful for your audience.
Oh, well, I know that the conversation we had the other day, I guarantee that's going to happen. There's not going to be a problem with that. And
Okay.
just reading through that, like you've sent me through a good length bio that has a lot more information. It took me quite a bit of work to get that down to just that little bit. And even in that, there's so much in there. So you've obviously had a very impactful life. You've had an impact on a lot of people. But what I'd love to know is, where did it all start for you?
Sorry?
Where did it start? So tell us your story from the beginning. Like, as you said, you've been teaching people at the age of 12,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
tutoring them. Tell us about that, please.
Well, that started, I was still in school. I always had it was very at ease with math and science in school. And some colleagues were not so at ease. So their parents asked me to help them out, to teach them. And that was the way I started my professional life at age 12 and never stopped again.
It's a pretty good early age to actually turn around and say, I've started my career at the age of 12. Most people, they just, at the age 12, they're just playing, they're doing other things. But tell us, well, let's go through your history of the work that you've done. Tell us what you've actually done through your life and the impact that you've had with people.
Well, I, I have a rather long career. Maybe I make up a summary. I started as a teenager working with microcomputers. That was at the end of the 70s when microcomputers came to our world, the pioneering Apple, Microsoft initiatives in the States. And I was one of the first to work with this technology here in South America, in Brazil, where I live. And this was a rather uncommon experience for people working in IT at the time. Most people still worked with huge computers, mainframes from IBM and such equipment. And so when I was 20, I was invited to work at one of the biggest banks here in Brazil to promote the implementation of this technology inside the bank. And over a period of 4 years where I stayed there, I grew my team from one person to over 40. And at that same time, I started writing and teaching about the subject and speaking publicly on congresses because that was a rather uncommon experience at that time. And so when I left the bank, I was at age 24. I started working on my own, and through this possibility of making my own schedule, then I started to taking more seriously my academic career. I had done a course in math, but then I started a master in computer science. And due to my previous experience, when I started the second year as a computer science student, then I was invited to be a professor at the university. I stayed there for 10 years. During that period, I founded my first company, and then I started working in IT trade associations as a volunteer. And during that same period, my two sons were born. So I had the difficulties in managing all of the things simultaneously. So at the end of the 90s, I left the universe. Yeah? And due to that, yeah, due to my mastery of languages, I was invited to take care of international relations in our local IT trade associations here in Brazil. And so I started participating both at the Ibero-American Federation, which unites entities from all of Latin America, plus Spain and Portugal. And further ahead with WITSA, the World Federation, which is based in the United States. And thanks to all of this, I had the opportunity to travel into almost 50 different countries, speak in many venues. I don't remember exactly how many, but I've spoken in many, many countries. I've been also, in the case of the Ibero-American Federation, I was the president for 4 years. During that time, I was invited twice to speak at the European Parliament. And all of this experience obviously is rather uncommon, not to say unique. And all of this background, in fact, was, I say, in some way planned from above, uh, in the sense that when then life brought other kinds of challenges, I was prepared in some way to handle them. That's the second part of the story. The
Excellent.
yeah, when I currently in my second marriage. My first marriage broke apart about 20 or 25 years ago or so. My current one's now between 15 and 20 years. Now, I had a couple of years interruption there in relation in the middle of the way. But in this second marriage, my wife adopted a girl when she was just born. Yeah, my stepdaughter, she in fact was the biological child of a couple who were drug users. And so when she got into the first experimentation of the lightest of them as a very young teenager, she rapidly got into what we call addiction.
Mm.
And over 2 to 3 years, things got worse every day. So, and it's a success story. And nowadays, she's in full recovery. She lives on her own. She works, she studies. But it was about 12 to 15 years of struggling with the problem.
Mm.
Nowadays, my wife and I are still involved in the subject in order to help other people who are going
Mm.
through similar problems, through similar dramas. Because this kind of problem is normally considered taboo. The first reaction we have when we are confronted with this kind of problem is that we have one of the worst problems in the world we could face,
Mm.
because nobody speaks about this openly.
Mm.
And when we go then into mutual support groups, as was suggested to us, you'll find out that's not true, that that's a problem which affects a lot of people. In
Mm.
fact, there are statistical studies from Brazilian universities, at least in our country, almost 15% of our population has a member of their family who in some way is involved with some kind of addiction. Doesn't matter if drugs, alcohol, sex, food, or whatever.
Mm.
Gaming, internet, and so on. And but even being such a huge number of people who suffer from this, the number of people who, in fact, participate in mutual support groups to, in some way, handle the problem and understand is very small. And this is the challenge we are still working on. About 5 years ago, we started a new mutual support group movement called Conscious Love, where we evolved a lot of concepts of other groups, but at the same time changed the way of doing the work. We started this almost simultaneously with the pandemic, and so we started to work at that time virtually, yeah, obviously, but that was not because of the pandemic. It was previously planned to do so in order to reach people, yeah, because many people live in cities where there are no support groups, and at least here in Brazil is known for some huge cities like São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Their metropolitan areas are in the order of 20 million people, but summed up, it's just 20% of the Brazilian population. We have hundreds of cities which would be called mid-sized, and these cities normally don't have this kind of service. Yeah? So at the same time, when we got into this kind of activity, yeah, obviously all my background participating in trade associations and having seen this on the international arena led me to ideas and to ask questions which probably had never been asked before. And it obviously, you have to be in some way diplomatic with people because egos are an important part of the game whenever you handle with other people. But after a couple of years, I managed to get introduced to the founder of this mutual support group movement in Brazil, which happened to be an American Jesuit named Harold Ram. He immigrated to Brazil at the end of the 60s and lived here until the end of 2019. He passed away at age almost 101. Yeah, it was just 2 or 3 months to his 101st birthday. And during his last years of life, I would say his last 5 or 6 years, I think I was one of his best friends when he got ill. My wife and me visited him regularly, and he was brilliant until his last days. Yeah, he had physical problems, but his brain worked perfectly. And we had lots of conversations on all kinds of subjects which are involved in mutual support groups. Yeah, beginning with the Serenity Prayer, which is used worldwide, yeah, coming to things like goal setting and living significantly. And it was very interesting conversations. He, as a Jesuit with his Ignatian or Christian uh, view of life, of his world view, and in my case, I am from a Jewish family. I never got into theological studies, but I read a lot. Some people, I've even been interviewed at some podcast. Someone called me a philosopher, which I'm also not. But uh, it seems to be due to the amount of materials I've read, booked, and can remember bringing them into conversation. So all of this summed up into many pieces of writing. And when we got into the subject of the Serenity Prayer, then Father Harold challenged me to transform this into a book. Yeah? And in fact, this book was published in Portuguese here in Brazil in 2019. He wrote the foreword to the book, and the book is called The Seven Keys to the Serenity Prayer. And basically, we focused on historical aspects of the prayer, how it became so popular, uh, its origins. We tried to research as much as possible. You find some traits of it even in ancient Rome, but in fact, the prayer got famous once it was adopted by chance in the 30s by Alcoholic Anonymous. And then that's the contents of the first book of the chapter. And then what we call the seven keys basically is a way to understand the meaning of the prayer. Because most people who participate in mutual support groups just repeat the prayer mechanically without thinking
Mm.
what the real meaning of this prayer is. It's a prayer which is used in even in Muslim countries. It's used in all kinds of cultures, and it has a very, very profound meaning. And so what we did is exactly going after this profound meaning and bringing up contents and from many different cultures.
Mm.
That was done not only in the main text, but uh, mutual support groups normally they read some short text or something to inspire them at the beginning of the meetings. And so the one idea we developed and which I got into the book is it's not just a book to read once. No? We want it to have a book that people could get back to it. And in order to facilitate this process, each chapter it has some small text boxes, many of them half a page, a bottom of a page, where we included some kind of or either a fable or a parable or something which can be read independently from the rest of the book and can inspire people to sit down, relax, and start working on a more spiritual level than at the moment they entered their meeting.
Mm.
And this has been done for the seven keys, which are obviously the first one is serenity. Serenity is analyzed in regards to what we call higher power, what you can call God or nature or whatever you believe in,
Mm.
but also in regards to psychology. And then we get into the other keys, which are acceptance, courage, wisdom, strength, faith, and joy. And joy is very Jesuitical, but it's important to live
Mm.
joyful, even if you have problems. That will help you go over them.
Mm.
So, and at the same time, I included some appendixes which cover some subjects which I which are themselves maybe seeds for new books. The first one is the relation between spirituality and atheism. Yeah?
Mm.
Because, we believe that people who do not believe in any religious system can be spiritual even in that case. And the other aspect, which is something which is in fact related to philosophy, which is a subject which I started my first writing, which were never published as a teenager, which is about the limits of the human reasoning capacity. Yeah? There's still some idea in popular, or let's say the collective mind of humanity, that science will evolve in order to explain everything. Yeah? But
Mm.
this is an obsolete vision of the world. Yeah? Science itself has already proved in math and in physics almost 100 years ago that it's incomplete. I
Mm.
go in detail in some detail into the second appendix of the book, but just to remember, you have the Gödel paradox in mathematical logic, and you have the uncertainty principle by Heisenberg in quantum physics, which limit what science can effectively prove. Yeah? So this means that our reasoning capacity, the apparatus we have inside our brains, have some limitations we cannot overcome. And most, if you don't want to go into some theoretical discussion, the way I normally explain this to people is, okay, let's suppose we are astronomers and we are observing the universe using our telescopes, our satellites, and all technology we have available. But even so, the farthest stars and we can observe are so far away that if that in fact doesn't exist physically but is a projection done by another civilization lying on the outside, we cannot decide if that's true or not. So that's the fact we can, and that is what we really proved in mathematics. When we establish any reasoning system, as simple as natural numbers, which we use for counting 1, 2, 3, yeah, that's enough to create things we cannot prove neither true nor false. And this means what there's behind you, you can believe in what you want. Your face is free to choose whatever you want to see behind that. But there is in fact, a space where human reasoning cannot get into. And accepting this fact is part of the process. It's very common when people uh, just start to really confront the problem of addiction, that they believe that studying medical papers and understanding the neurological principles of addiction will help them in some way to help their relatives who are suffering from the problem. It's a very common uh, reaction based on this belief that the reasoning system will find a solution for that. But this doesn't work. And normally uh, people try this for a year or two, and then they understand that this technical knowledge is important for psychiatrists, for psychologists. But when we have this problem, this kind of problem in our families, yeah, this kind of knowledge is in some way useful, but it doesn't solve the problem. Yeah? Basically, when we have someone involved in addiction in our family, yeah, what happens first during the process of getting into addiction is that all family members, not only the one getting into addiction, but people who live with him, very in very small on a small pace, they change their behaviors, yeah, without noticing. And in order to get out of the problem, first you have to recognize this fact, and then knowing about the fact that behavior is so important, working in order to change your behavior to help the person who got into addiction. And this process is generally the same as an analogy to when you get some uh, some water on a boiler, and you if you put your hand into that when water is still cold, and then you will put fire on, and the water gets warm in very small steps. So you get accustomed, and you will only perceive that your hand is getting red, or even worse, when water is almost boiling. So, and that's the same process we undergo normally in families where a member or more of them get into addiction. People only notice they have a problem when it's already very, very far from the beginning.
That's
Because we
right.
have not been taught, the subject is not covered in any kind of formal education. So this is a real challenge for most of us in many different societies. I've been in many countries around the world, and the situation is the same in Christian countries, in Orthodox countries, in
Mm,
Muslim countries. In fact, what people are, when they start using this kind of chemical substances which lead into addiction, they in fact are using this as some kind of self-medication to relieve themselves from some kind of problems,
mm,
but
that's it.
then the problems they create for themselves using this self-medication is even worse than the ones they had before.
Yeah,
Normally,
yeah,
it's this what happens.
yeah. Yeah. So, in what all the stuff that you've been talking about there, my God, that we've covered so many subjects, so many different thoughts have come to me as well. It's like, as you said, that, well, first of all, your academic levels, the work that you've done in the past, everything else, having a stepdaughter who had an addiction affects you the same as it affects somebody else who's just going, getting up in the morning, going to work, coming home again and working for somebody else who doesn't really get involved in academia or anything else. And it's not just the person who has the addiction, it's all the people around them. So we
Mm.
might say there are so many, hundreds of thousands of people who have got drug addictions, but then it's millions of people who are affected by it. And I
Yeah.
know a lot of parents who, or people who have got, children or brothers, sisters, etc., or even parents who have addicted to in one way or another, how they can actually help. Because if you're watching a family member or somebody close to you who's going through an addiction, you feel helpless. How do I help them, etc.? And so this is why, as you said, we need support from other people who can help
Mhm.
us through that. It's the fact that also what I'm getting from this as well is when you mentioned uh, Harold, for instance, and 101 passing away at that age and being mentally active all the way through. It also is a reminder to me to keep myself, active with my thoughts and investigating and reading and learning and everything else. Because keeping the mind active helps to keep it young.
Mhm. Yes. I didn't mention in the case of Father Harold not until he was 96, he practiced yoga also. Yeah. So it was not only something from the brain, but also physically very, very
Mm,
strong. Yes, and I think this is something, you know, nowadays is part of our culture.
mm,
Practicing physical activity is something most health professionals recommend. Yeah, but in fact, in this case, he was a very, very special person,
mm,
and he helped thousands of people. And in some way, I consider myself in duty to him because all of
mm,
this uh, helped us also to surpass the problem in our own family. When you were asking how to do this, normally what happens is when people get into any kind of addiction, they start to have some kind of problems they didn't have before.
mm,
Okay, it depends on the kind of addiction, but basically, if you look at the medical definition of addiction, it doesn't involve the subject or the substance being used. When you ask a psychiatrist for the definition, or if you take the American standard from the American Psychiatric Association. Basically, they have seven criteria looking at people's behavior in order to check if they can be considered to be addicted or not. So, for example, one criteria is if this new activity in some way makes people uh, incapable of working or studying or conducting what previously was their normal routine. It doesn't matter if you were using drugs or you kept all night playing some game online.
mm,
If you cannot get up in the morning to take care of your duties, then you have new kinds of problems. So
mm,
the first thing is identifying these facts. The second one is when people who are into addiction get into these new behaviors, then obviously they will suffer some consequences.
mm,
What normally is the first reaction of people around them is to protect them from these consequences. So
mm,
it's very common for a mother to call their son's boss to say, oh, he won't go to work today because he and makes up any
mm,
excuse, which is not the correct one. Yeah? And what we've learned that this kind of behavior, trying to protect addicted
mm,
people from the consequences of what they are doing, is not the way to go. In fact, they only will uh, perceive that they are having bad consequences from the process if they need to handle the consequences by themselves. Because the process of recovery will only be successful if people can by themselves identify that what they are losing due to their addiction is more valuable than what they gain from the pleasures they gain from
mm.
addiction process itself.
Makes sense.
So and so what the kind of behavior we need to adapt ourselves to change to help out the addicted people is always thought out to make this period of time as short as possible. Yeah?
Mm,
Because when we have someone into addiction, let's say someone addicted into food and eats excessive amounts of food, that person will obviously get very fat. And if that situation is true for too long, maybe people will have health problems. They will go into other health
mm,
problems which are not directly related to the original problem. And the
mm,
same happens with alcohol and drugs. Each kind of addiction has its own
mm,
period. Alcohol, for example, is one of the most difficult addictions for people to perceive themselves because the process is very long.
mm,
Alcohol will destroy your inner organs like kidney, for example, but it
mm,
takes in average 25 years or more. So when people start drinking as youngsters, they will only feel the physical consequences when they are into their 50s or 60s. But
mm,
then most of them don't live up to their 70s because
mm,
yeah. So in this case, it's very difficult. The most heaviest drugs, which are the so-called heavy drugs, in that sense, are easier to for people to understand that they have a real problem because the process of getting into the consequences is very fast. Yeah. In many cases, people start to live on the streets. They abandon their families. And obviously, this brings a lot of additional problems for them. Yeah.
mm,
And in that case, it's much easier for the person to understand that the usage of that substance has led them to a situation which is very poor condition for their lives.
mm.
Yeah,
It takes them
yeah.
into something that.
This is just some examples
Mm,
of the process and how we who are around people with these problems can help out. And all of this techniques now are shared by people during the group meetings, and people tell what they are doing, and then others will comment what they have done, what's working, what's not. And this kind of knowledge, unfortunately, is not available in other places. There's no academic organization of this kind of knowledge. It's not
Mm.
available as a university degree. So on the other side, obviously, the medical sciences can also contribute to the process. In many cases, people get into addiction because they previously had another problem. Let's say a person was previously depressed or anxious or whatever.
Mm.
But depending on the substance they are using, yeah, the effects of the substance will be much bigger on their lives than the problem they had before. So normally what happens is when you manage to make their addiction getting slower, or
Mm.
most successful cases even to stop completely, then
Mm.
the original problems are come again onto the surface. Some people say it's as an iceberg. Some people say it's an onion where you have to get into the heart of the problem.
Mm.
And there are many analogies to explain this, but in fact, in many cases, you have some original personal trauma where people are not prepared to handle it, so they use some kind of substance to try to forget. Yeah,
That's
that's
it. And
the
so
yeah.
once you take
Uh-huh.
using that
Yes. Uh-huh.
substance, you then add to it because you now feel worse. So you're now going to have another hit. Then you feel worse again. So you're going to have another hit. And it becomes a cycle. So you're always falling further and further behind.
Mm-hmm.
With the understanding of it, I think that's one of the biggest issues for the people around the person with the addiction, those that want to help them and support them, is for them to actually understand how all this works. I was just thinking, with your book, you said it was in Portuguese. Is that right?
Yes, the book was originally written in Portuguese. It was published here in Brazil 2019 by one of the biggest publishing houses in nonfiction here in our country. And at that time, when I signed the contract, they also wanted the rights for translations, but they didn't do any. So I managed at the end of 2024 to get back the rights to translations. And due to the fact that it's already 5 years later, obviously we continue to learn. That's another important subject.
Mm.
I did a revision for the text, yeah, to be like it a second edition, and this is now available in as a preliminary version in English. I am working to submit this as a manuscript to publishers in the US or in the UK or in Australia, wherever. I'm researching publishing houses. I'm working with some people who are mentoring me to find the right publisher so that the text will be available in English also. In fact, Father Harold, as an American, from the first day we started writing this, he said to me, "One day I want to see this published in English."
Excellent. So there's a reason, another reason for making sure that happens.
Yeah. Huh?
It, it's
So
well,
that's what I'm
English
working
being,
currently on. Yeah. Uh-huh. The
yeah.
text has already been revised by people in America, so in English, there's a preliminary version ready. Yeah, what basically is not finished. It's common for books in America to have a long list of endorsement or appraisals, and I have a lot of them from people in various countries. I am contacting them again in order to get authorized to publish their names or not, just the initials in English. And Then the second part is finding the right publishing house, because as I live in Brazil, it's very
Mm,
difficult to do this in another country. But as
mm,
the world has gotten smaller and fully virtual, I think we are having opportunities which
mm,
we wouldn't have before. This conversation here
mm,
is happening over 13 time zones and on two parts of
mm.
the world, which probably would never have met before if we didn't have this kind of possibilities. So I
Well,
think
that's it.
in some way it's the right time, the right moment for
Mm.
this process. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're finding a lot of people are becoming more aware. They're looking at their lives, the issues, and things like that. We're finding men are now stepping up and opening up a lot more than they did before. So I think you're right. The timing is right now. Uh, 10 years ago, probably it wouldn't have been
Hmm.
because, as you said, we don't talk about this stuff. We try and push it down because we're worried about what other people think of us instead of focusing on, well, how let's focus on
Hmm.
improving our lives and the lives of those around us. And in doing that, we've got to step into this. We need to be able to have those discussions. We need to have a better awareness and remove the stigma away from all of this as well.
Hmm. Yeah, you
Because
are
when I
absolutely
look
right.
at when I look at the scale of mental health, and people say, oh, there's those people with mental health and those people without, I look at it and go, no, we're all on the scale. It just depends on which end of the continuum we are today.
Hmm.
And depending on our circumstances, we could very easily slip from one end to the other end, uh, and have all those, have the same life or a similar life to somebody who's going through those addictions at the moment. It's just a matter of circumstances and how we choose to respond to them.
Uh-huh.
So the more knowledge we have, the more discussions we have, and the more support we have around us, the less chance of those things going the wrong way.
Uh-huh. Yes, of course. And if you let me add another aspect
Mm,
of the current version, let's say, of the problem, you were talking about mental health. Uh, when originally people started using uh, chemical substances, that started to be something popular in the US at the 60s or 70s, the people who produced these substances basically used what they found in nature. There was no genetical or chemical industrial adaptation for
mm,
this product. But nowadays, yeah, technology is so cheap that even people who do this illegally can work to manipulate plants genetically, can do set up chemical laboratories to modify substances, and obviously they do this in order to promote their illegal business, which is
mm. That's
getting
right.
people into addiction as soon as possible so that they can sell more. So nowadays, for example, yeah, we hear frequently about uh, kinds of drugs which are 100% synthetical, developed inside laboratories, which do not exist in nature, and which have very, very strong effects on people in a very, very short period of time.
Mm,
And the more the faster this process goes, obviously the damages it produces on human brains will be bigger. So uh, that's another aspect, independently from the scientific or technological development. What we observe in support groups is that people who get into addiction nowadays, you have a much bigger proportion of people who suffer from addiction and some additional mental health problem,
mm,
which if you look into the past, let's say 20 to 30 years ago, that was an uncommon situation. People
mm,
were addicted, but they had no additional problem. And nowadays, eh, it's very common for people to have more than one diagnosis. When they go to a
mm,
psychiatrist, they not only are diagnosed as as addicted, but they also get into some additional mental health problem.
Mm.
Obviously, there are a lot of them. I'm not a specialist to diagnose anyone, but that's what we observe from what people share during our meetings. Yeah,
Mm.
this is nowadays a very common situation that people are involved in some way with substance abuse, but that's only part of their problem. Yeah?
Mm.
They have other mental health problems, and that obviously makes the challenge even bigger. Because
Mm.
what I always tell people is when they start participating in support groups uh, is that when you have some problem in your brain, that's very difficult to recognize. Ne? When if you are walking on the street and you fall down and you look at your leg and there's a lot of blood outside, or you even maybe, eh, then you will use your brain to decide if you go home or if you
Mm.
go to the hospital.
Mm.
But if what's damaged is your brain, then you have to use your damaged brain to decide. And that
Mm.
will probably not be the best decision because
That's
the
right.
organ you are using to decide is damaged in some way.
Mm.
Yeah? And this means that when people are in the process of addiction, they have a very, uh, they, it's very tough for them to understand what happens. Yeah? Unless they live the external consequences of their problem because they are not looking are not able to look into their what's happening inside them. No? They
Mm.
they have to suffer from external consequences like not having enough food or not having good hygienic
Mm.
conditions or things which they can perceive that they never had this kind of problems before. That's a consequence of their addiction.
It shows that we really need to be aware of, our family, what's going on around, etc., being there to support, knowing that somebody who's going through an addiction is not in the mental thought process of being able to take action themselves. So it's one of the reasons why I think, as you said, we need to be talking about this. We need to be talking about this at an early age, having those
Mhm.
conversations with our kids so as they're growing up, they understand these things so that when something does happen in their lives, they don't look for an easy alternative to try and feel good in the moment, which is
Mhm.
taking them to an addiction. So to be able to then go and talk to somebody about what's going on so that they can get support with somebody else as opposed to trying to find something external that's going to become a problem over time.
Exactly.
Right on that.
Yeah.
So that,
So then, and this kind of analysis normally people who start participating in our support groups, relatives, parents, or brothers, or mothers, or children from people who got into addiction, they don't have this panorama clear. They don't
mm,
understand this, and I don't know how it's currently in Australia, but here in Brazil, as in the US, there are a lot of rehab equipment available.
mm,
But law requires that people to be participating in a rehab clinic have to be there as volunteers. And
mm,
if they don't understand what's happening to them and they don't agree with this, then it's very difficult
exactly.
for them
Mm,
to go into this process. In cases where people are, let's say, so ill they don't function anymore. At least here in Brazil, we have some psychiatric hospitals where people can stay. But in that case, it's the same as if you suffer a heart attack. If you suffer a heart attack, it's not you who will decide if
mm,
you go to the hospital or not. It will
mm.
be the person who comes to help you out,
Very
maybe
doctors. Mm,
your relative or some
mm,
paramedic or whatever.
mm.
and that's the in extreme cases. But this process also this brings us into public policy about this subject, and this is something which is very, very different in many countries around the world.
Yeah.
Even after the rehab process, when people get out of this, the process of bringing people to participate again as normal citizens in society is also something which varies a lot from country to country. And
That's it.
yes, in Europe, for example, in many Western European countries, government provides some temporary houses for these people after that, uh, when they start the recovery process to live there, to get assistance until they get new jobs and can provide for themselves again. But this is something, for example, which doesn't exist in the US. It exists here in Brazil, but not provided by government as a private service. So it's only available to families which are rather wealthy. And I don't know how it's in your country.
Yeah. Well, varies around the world, but the problems that we have are pretty much the same thing, same addictions, etc. It's with what I'm looking at there is that yes, we in some countries we have a solution for once the addiction's in place, recognised, etc., to try and help that person. But the conversations need to be starting long before that, so that we cut the supply of people going into those addictions. You know, always working on the tail end of, we're never going to be out of business. Anybody who works in those fields will always have plenty of people. And in fact, they'll have more work every year because the situation is getting worse. We've got to come to the front end. We've got to have those conversations where we can actually make people more aware before they get sidetracked into the addictions.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
that's what's necessary. But what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Well, I have a Instagram profile. We have the YouTube channel for our support group, which is called Conscious Love, Amor Consciente in Portuguese on YouTube. And I'm available to present these ideas to any group who would be interested in. I've always shared what I learned, as I said in the beginning, since I was a very young teenager. So that hasn't changed.
Excellent. And that's the thing that we want to be able to get that out of you before you get to that older age and pass on, because that's information that's lost. It's experience, because yes, we've got all the knowledge in the world that's coming through. We can read all of that, but the experience of actually being involved in those things is far more valuable. Knowledge is one thing, but wisdom comes from the taking of that knowledge and putting the experience with it to create something greater again. So we do panel discussions within the Campfire project, and I'll be getting those up and running again shortly. And it's the subject that we should have a chat about. So I'll send you an invitation to those panel discussions as well.
Okay.
Excellent.
Great.
In the meantime, when I put the post up, I'll make sure that all of those links go in, your YouTube channel, your Instagram, etc. And any idea when the English version of your book will be available?
Well, I'm working. My goal is to have a contract signed still this year. So probably, yeah, if from what I know from the process of publishing a book that normally takes as long as a baby, between 6 to 9 months. So it will probably be available next year.
Excellent. Well, we'll be looking forward to that. So when it does go to the English translation comes out, can you please let us know? And we'd like to be able to share that within the group, let everybody know about it, because the stuff that you explained in there, I think really puts a new angle on it, a new way of looking at it, and something that would be extremely valuable to a lot of people, including myself. So I'll be very much interested in seeing the English version.
Okay, I'll let you know as soon as it's available.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for being here today with me, Roberto. I've really enjoyed
Thanks
it.
for having me, Alan.
You're welcome. And to everybody else, thank you for being here today. And make sure that you go through. If you got any questions, go and have a look at the YouTube channel, the Instagram, etc. follow Roberto. Got any questions for him, just send them through his contact details and through his contact methods and have a chat with him. But again, Roberto, thank you very much for being here today. And
Thank you
you and
again.
everybody else, we'll see you on the next Campfire project.
Okay, thank
Bye
you.
for now.